The weather was too foul for the helicopter to fly, and so we had to wait for the RAF mountain rescue team to come on foot. Even though we were much lower down the mountain than we had been, it was still extremely cold, and by now darkness had fallen. A high wind and driving snow enhanced the sense of danger. I had a torch and a whistle, and began SOS signalling, but John and I had to wait there for 4 hours before any sign of rescue. Another party, loosely fitting our description, 2 men, 1 young with a broken leg, had fallen lower down the mountainside. The RAF picked them up and thought they'd rescued us. They hadn't. The team arrived back at base, and there waited an anxious David and Andrew. "It's okay, we've got them," said the RAF. David looked at the faces and said, "That's not Graham, and that's not John either." The RAF team set out again, with David showing the route of our descent. 4 hours at minus temperatures in the dark somewhere on a mountainside is a bit telling on the spirit and strength. John wasn't too bad, as some of the other climbers had stopped on their way down and provided extra blankets. I was worried. I continued blowing my whistle and flashing the torch at intervals, as you're supposed to, and waited for a return signal. Wonderful. I heard their whistle way below and to the left of us. I increased my blowing. A marvellous moment this. I heard a distant shout. They must have seen my light. I saw their light quickly return my flash. That was fan-bloody-tastic. All thoughts of what eternity smells like had vanished. They climbed up to us and gave me some hot soup as John was carefully strapped onto a tubular alloy mountain rescue stretcher. Then we had to lower him down the mountainside. Quite a big team is involved in these kind of operations. You have to have 1 person going down in front to work out the best route, a couple of bearers at the front of the stretcher, 3 on either side, and a team of about 8 others hanging onto ropes behind so that the stretcher can be lowered down crags and cliffs. Being a non-injured party, I was naturally expected to help, and so took my place hanging onto the ropes at the back. I was so exhausted I couldn't help for long. My hands couldn't grip any more, and I kept stumbling. The last 300 feet down were too much for me. I gave up and said, "Sorry, I can't help any more," and slid down the rest of the way on my arse. I couldn't even walk. It was appalling. Once the stretcher party reached the footpath, they set off at a quicker pace. One of the RAF team stayed behind with me just to make sure I didn't stagger into the lake, which was almost exactly near 0 degrees centigrade as you can get without water actually being ice. The unfortunate thing was that what is normally a causeway across the lake, Lyn Padan, in the winter isn't. It is 4 feet deep in ice-cold water, either side of which, should you step off, is 40 feet of ice-cold water, which isn't good for anyone's health. Either that, or you go round the lake, a 4-mile-long slog. I didn't want to go 4 miles, as opposed to 100 yards, neither did the man with me. But we had to cross that lake, guided only by the lights of the Land Rover on the other side. It was pitch black, and if we'd slipped off either side, we'd both have been dead, no doubt about that. We got across, up to the waist in my case, in ice-cold water, at the end of what had been a rather long day. David had by now crossed it 3 times. We arrived back at the Penigurith Hotel, and John was taken off to hospital. We discovered that all the residents had been listening to the rescue on shortwave radio because the owner of the hotel, Chris Briggs, used to be a mountain rescue organizer. His hotel, after all, was the base for the training of the Everest team. We got back there to, well, it wasn't thunderous applause, but it was a lot of interest because they'd all been listening to the rescue in progress. The rescue team had no time to receive thank-you drinks. They were already out scouring the peaks for 3 more missing climbers. Anyway, John had been taken off to Bangor Hospital. David and Andrew and I felt we deserved several pints of beer and quite a few scotches, a meal and more scotches, only to be rung up at about 11 o'clock by Bangor Hospital, who said that the young man called John Tomicek was refusing to stay in hospital. I asked them about the x-rays, whether they'd x-rayed his head because of the injury to it. They had, no signs of damage, and his leg only had a hairline fracture. I thought, he's had a hell of a day anyway, and obviously wants to be with his friends. I told them, send him round to the Penigurith Hotel and I'll do a head chart on him. We can have him back to you in 20 minutes if anything goes wrong. This meant checking his pulse, pupils, blood pressure and breathing rate regularly. The next morning, the local police came round to the hotel wanting to see me and asked, "Who is this John Tomicek? What do you know about him?" I told them the story of how I came to meet John and how he came to be with us. They then said, "What would you say if we told you he's 14 years old and has been missing from home for 9 months? I said I'd tell you exactly what I just have. That's what happened. If it had not been so, the word kidnapping would spring to mind, but I'd been trying to find out where his parents were, etc., etc. What had happened, of course, because of the routine police check-up on Mountain Rescue, was that they'd actually found out his home address, and his father was coming to collect him. He was a bit late in arriving. It's not far from Liverpool to the Penny-Gurrieth, about a 2-hour drive, but his father took 5. I thought, if that was a son of mine, I'd have been there in a flash. But after I'd queried his delay with a raised eyebrow, John's father and I got on rather well. We both came to the conclusion that if he were taken back to Huyton, Liverpool, he would only run away again. John's mother had died some 5 years ago, and his father had 4 other children to look after on his own. A proud man, understandably, he did not want institutional care for them. John had been asked to leave one rather strict Roman Catholic grammar school, and was a persistent truant at another. We asked him, would you go back to school if you stayed in London? Yes, said John. So, informally, he became my ward, and I his guardian. An odd feeling, suddenly becoming the parent of a teenager. All my paternal instincts emerged. Suddenly it was exactly as if John were my son. Before returning to London, John went to stay with his father for a couple of weeks. We were going to Jersey to do some python filming, and John arrived back in London in time to join me on that trip. I was very pleased to see him, and so was David. Our flat was his home. The local Nick, the Hampstead Nick, rang that very morning and said, "We'd like to have a talk to you, Dr. Chapman, about the John Tomichek business." I said, Oh, well, all right. "Shall we come up to your place?" No, I'll come up to the police station, don't worry," I told them. "As it happens, John's here at the moment. He's just arrived." "Is he? Well, you'd better bring him too." John and I both went up to the police station. We had about 3 hours before catching the plane for Jersey, and we were kept there for 2 being questioned, John being rather more fiercely interrogated than I. After all, I was a doctor. A rather nervous Sergeant Green of the CID, the Hampstead Perverts branch, was questioning me. Eventually he plucked up courage. "There's one thing I do have to ask, Dr. Chapman," after a long pause. "Are you a homosexual?" I said, "Yes." He was expecting the more convenient answer, "No." And then everything would have been all right. We would just have gone. But having had several articles published in which I stated that I was a homosexual, I didn't feel I could say no, and I couldn't honestly say no anyway. But obviously they had to check to make sure nothing was going on between John and myself. They then tried to get in contact with his father and eventually reached him by telephone and said to him, "I gather you've given permission for your son John to go to Jersey with Graham Chapman." His father said, "Yes, that's true." The police then said, "Did you know that Dr. Chapman was a homosexual?" And he said, "Yes." And then there was nothing they could do, much against their better judgment. We just caught our plane to Jersey. It may surprise the police, but I happen to believe, along with every homosexual that I've ever met, that it is antisocial and insensitive in the extreme for anyone of whatever sex to attempt to force any sort of physical attention on another person. John had found a stable, happy home and soon had a circle of friends at his new school. Apart from my being a bad influence in that my drinking habits encouraged him to drink too much, I think David and I have done a pretty good job, and we're proud of him.